Today I'm going to be talking about Walter Brueggemann, one of the greatest theologians in my opinion, and I think that Dr. Michelson shares that same opinion. So let me tell you a little bit about him. In 1933, in Tilden, Nebraska, one fateful day, Walter Brueggemann was born, and his father was a German evangelical pastor, and he really shaped Walter's life from a very young age, since he grew up in a pastor's home. He received his undergraduate degree in theology from Elmhurst College in 1955, and then went on to get his master's in 1958 from Eden Theological Seminary, and continued his course of study at Union Theological Seminary, where he received his doctorate in theology in 1961. Soon after that, he went back to his alma mater and began to teach at Eden Theological Seminary. While he was teaching, he received a PhD in education from St. Louis University. And so, in doing that, in 1986, he moved to Columbia Theological Seminary and began teaching, where he taught until 2003. And, still to this day, as some articles have said, still teaches. And that would make sense. He has written over 100 books and still is writing books that are being published today. Just recently, a few months ago, his publication of Preaching from the Old Testament was released earlier this year. He is an ordained minister by the United Church of Christ, and he currently resides in Cincinnati, Ohio, with his wife, Tia. So a little bit about the time, because this is the life and times section. So a little bit about the time that he was born in. So he was raised in the 60s, and it was among this a lot of civil unrest, and JFK was assassinated, and the Vietnam War was still going on, and he lived through all these things. And from this time arose this man named Martin Luther King Jr. You might have heard of him. He's a little famous, who really changed the world and started to shape the opinions of Walter Brueggemann. The racial injustice in the world was felt by Walter, and even today he talks about, in his book titled Tenacious Solidarity, he talks about in this one chapter called Choosing Against Chosenness. He uses passages from Exodus and Jeremiah, and through these passages he deals with these hard issues to talk about. And while this article was fairly recent, he has held these opinions for quite some times, and it can be seen all throughout his life's work. Speaking of his life work, his methodology, Walter Brueggemann's methodology began to form during his times of studying at the universities. And I say universities because, 5 of them. But no, there was this thing that he called a common theology that he felt was strung out through the entirety of the Old Testament. And this common theology, he references it quite a lot in this text that I read, called The Flowering of Old Testament Theology. And he talks about this common theology that's interwoven throughout all of the Old Testament, through the Old Testament stories. So, in an excerpt from that book, we begin to read more in depth about embracing pain and this idea of this common theology. And this idea of embracing pain in this common theology provides an ordered sense of a life lodged in the sovereignty of God. This theology also sees God as a creator in relation to creation. The idea of a common theology is obviously not the only type of theology that is throughout all of the Old Testament. So in his research of this common theology, he begins to see this crisis forming in a way of looking at the Old Testament. This section of these chapters from the Olenberger text begin to talk about Israel. And if you know anything about Walter Brueggemann, he is an advocate for modern day Israel and its biblical claims. But no, it's in this section it says it begins to show a link between Yahweh and Israel, and soon an intensification of Yahweh's anger and impatience. It becomes increasingly clear through the stories of the Deuteronomistic history and all the way into Lamentations, where it seems that the people have stopped hearing the word of God, and they're not hearing this truth. And then things start happening. The destruction and pain and war, all these things are around them. And then in the midst of it, they begin lamenting. And this lamenting is in themselves a deconstruction of them. It's a humbling of themselves. And as the flowering of the Old Testament puts it, this common theology has it say, the outcome for Jerusalem is tightly tied to disobedience. So let's jump back to that idea of embracing pain as a part of this common theology that Brueggemann talks about. In this movement to embrace pain, one must find a way to remember the experience of the pain. When this takes place, you begin to take steps back to this idea called common theology and move into a place where experiencing pain is okay. There are 3 practices in the process of embracing pain. The practice of embracing pain must always be in tension with the legitimization of structure. The embrace of pain is crucial to the minority voice of the Old Testament. And it is the disregard of pain embrace in our time and every time which permits persons and institutions to be unconditionally committed to structure legitimization. When Israel begins to lament, they start the process of moving away from common theology that they used to hold so tightly to. They begin to take risks, and just the sheer fact of them lamenting was a risk for them. And the book says they refuse to settle for the way things were. As I said earlier, Walter is a huge advocate for modern day Israel and its biblical claims, as seen throughout the way he discusses Israel and the ways in which they view theology, whether it is referring to this common theology or to the later refusal to settle, that attitude that they have. His methodology was shaped by those ideas. So Walter's contributions to the world through Old Testament theology are numerous, from books, speaking engagements, to articles. His most famous article being one called The Liturgy of Abundance and the Myth of Scarcity. And that's really where I wanted to end this. In his article, he gained quite a lot of attention for it over the last years since it was published in the late 90s. But throughout this article, Brueggemann talks about this abundance of God's faithfulness throughout the stories of the overarching story of the Old Testament and the whole Bible itself. And then he goes on to talk about the abundance poured out in the Psalms. In one specific section of the article, Brueggemann writes, Psalm 150, the last psalm in the book, is an exuberant expression of the amazement of God's goodness. It just says, praise Yahweh with a lute, praise Yahweh with a trumpet, praise, praise, praise. And I just think that Walter Brueggemann's life and his story and the way that he has shaped the Old Testament and Old Testament theology, but the way he has framed the Old Testament through his work in Old Testament theology, he has always talked about this liturgy of abundance and tried to debunk this myth of scarcity. Thank you.